Okay, Kate, I think we start right at the very beginning. What actually motivated you to write this book? So I was very struck in your introduction. You said, as a consequence of another idea failing, you then went to this, and I was fascinated. What motivated you?
Yeah, I think this book kind of started a long time ago, and I've for a long time been interested in political parties and the role that they play in society. And I was really interested, I suppose, all the way kind of through my PhD and afterwards, which was on ideology and these kind of ideas that political parties were in decline. So there were around kind of 2015, there were so many debates around falling party membership, around party identification decreasing, and around voter turnout indicating that voters just weren't engaged. And particularly around political parties, there was a lot of discussion about how their kind of traditional role within society, where they perform this kind of linkage function, where they connect to citizens on the one hand and to the state on the other, was kind of breaking down. So there were lots of quotes about, the viability of party democracy failing, and how there were real concerns about what was going to happen to parties in the future. So I'd kind of quite, for a long time, been interested in these debates, and they'd informed some of the earlier works that I'd done. But I was becoming really interested in what was happening around 2015 in parties. So there were a lot of efforts to reach out and to try and kind of solve this problem that parties were seen to have in their connections with citizens. So we saw things like the Labour Party created a registered supporters scheme where people could kind of pay a really small amount to sign up and get involved in the political party. And there were also things like the open primaries that the Conservatives did, where they let people in the local constituency select the MP. And I was really interested in these initiatives and these kind of attempts to connect parties back up with people, but I was just really unconvinced that they were going to work. So I think kind of in that context of kind of being interested in what was going on around parties for a long time, I started to really think about, well, what do we know about what people want from parties? And I was reading through the literature and looking at what existing academic debates have said, and it really struck me that so many of the assumptions that we were making about parties were based on kind of proxies for information. So you look at party membership, for example, and it was interesting at the time that I was writing the book that party membership was actually really fluctuating, and there were a number of notable kind of increases in some parties. And it kind of led me to think, well, perhaps actually membership isn't really telling us anything about what people think about parties. And perhaps turnout is the same. Maybe these are kind of trends that aren't really telling us very much about people's views. So the book kind of started out as an attempt to really rethink what we know and understand about public perceptions of parties. And I think I was particularly interested in thinking about whether people had ideals that they didn't see were being enacted nowadays, and whether it was the case that there were kind of these things that people wanted to see but they just weren't actually seeing in practice, and if so, what were they? So I thought that there was a kind of really good case to set out and do some more public opinion research, which was trying to kind of gather data about parties in a different way in order to test these assumptions about the position of parties in the future of democracy.
Okay, so before we get on to what you found, let me just again, I was very struck by the title of your book, The Reimagined Party, and I wonder if you just explain a little, how you came up, why you came on that particular title, and what it symbolizes.
Yeah, so the Reimagined Party is, I'm sure as any kind of author will tell you, coming up with the idea that encapsulates what you've found is really tricky, and it was something that emerged in the kind of last 6 months of the book as I was trying to find a way of explaining what I'd found. And I think the best way to kind of explain it is to think about those debates about what was going on with parties. And there was a lot of talk at a certain point about, people just didn't like party democracy. They wanted populist government, and there was a big upsurge in literature around populist movements. Or, they wanted kind of technocrats. They didn't want to be involved. And I just didn't really find any evidence of that. When I went out and kind of collected data on people's views of parties, what I did find was that people were actually quite attracted to some of the essential ideas around party democracy. So if you kind of think about what parties are for, they have this kind of mediating role where they go out, they link to citizens and they channel citizens' ideas into politics, but they also balance that with being responsible and making decisions that are in the interest of the nation. But then they also offer political choice and present different programs to the people to choose between. And what I was finding was that people were still attracted to these ideas, but that there were things about the way that parties were currently performing these roles that they just didn't like. So what I was finding was repeated evidence from a certain group of respondents that they wanted parties to be far more open and inclusive, wanted to be listening to different views and to be responding to the views of a much wider group of people than they were perceived to be doing. And they also wanted, they really liked this idea of responsibility and acting in the national interest, but it was about thinking about, well, what were then parties presenting by way of choice? People didn't want these kind of dogmatic partisan agendas, but they did want a vision. They wanted parties to be still presenting choice. They just wanted that kind of vision articulated in a different way. So I kind of had all this data that was telling me that people still liked parties, but they wanted them to behave differently. And I'm a bit of a car enthusiast, and there's this idea in the car industry of this kind of reimagined cars. And I was talking to my husband about it, and we were talking about what happened to the Mini. And I think there's an analogy I offer at the beginning of the book, which I think tries to kind of capture what I mean by this reimagined idea. So if you think about the Mini, it was an incredibly successful car when it was originally released. Sold hundreds of thousands of versions, but over time it's kind of started waning in popularity. And what was kind of seen to make it really fun at the outset and engaging and made people want to buy it, over time just it didn't quite appeal to what people wanted anymore. They were becoming used to SUVs that were a bit bigger and a bit more elevated. They wanted power steering and electric seats and all of these functions, and that were new and reflected how things were changing in society. And what Mini did is they took the kind of exciting features that everyone loved from the original Mini, but they updated it so that it also reflected what people wanted in a modern society, and rethought what the car should look like. And I think that process of kind of taking something that is still the essence of the original is there, but thinking about reinterpreting it and thinking about new values and ideas and modern needs is what I think that is a useful way of thinking about what I think parties need to do, which isn't saying that we just need to get rid of parties and start with a whole new system. I've found evidence that people do still like parties and they're attracted to a lot of what parties are there to do, but there's something about the way the parties are performing their functions that no longer resonates with people. So they need to change and update and reimagine the way that they're performing the functions that they've historically done. And I think why this idea for me is particularly useful is for a couple of reasons. So firstly, it suggests that these kind of one-off quick fixes that parties have been pursuing over recent years won't work, because it's not just a case of adding a new function to a political party. You need to rethink the ethos and the way the entire thing operates. But the other reason that I like it is that reimagination can be done in many different ways. And if you think about car designers, when they were designing the new Mini, they probably went through many iterations, and each designer kind of came up with their own interpretation of what that reimagination could look like. And I think that's the case for political parties as well. I'm not offering a kind of a one-size-fits-all solution that every party is going to buy in. But what I'm trying to say is that every political party, I would argue, can benefit by thinking about their ethos and about how they might be able to change to reflect the findings that I've uncovered in the book, and how they're going to adapt and interpret these ideas themselves.
Okay, so you've already said a lot about what people want from political parties, and before I think you come on to the guts of your book, or what people want, perhaps you ought to tell us just a little bit about the methods you've used in order to glean this public opinion. How have you gone about that?
Yeah, so I did two main different things. So for people who aren't familiar, party politics scholarship tends to be quite divided. There is people who use quantitative survey methods, and there's another group of scholars who use kind of interviews and more in-depth studies. And it's a bit of an artificial divide, but there isn't much conversation between the two traditions. So what I tried to do in this book is bring them together. So I commissioned and wrote and designed a survey with YouGov that was fielded to just under 1,500 people. That I called the party survey. So this was about 30 questions asking about people's ideals and perceptions of parties. And then I also conducted what I'm calling deliberative workshops. So these were kind of 3 workshops where we got around 25 people together in a room, sat them down in groups, and then spent 4 hours talking about different themes, introducing them to new information, really kind of using the opportunity to go beyond people's kind of initial first reactions to really tease apart their perceptions of what was going on. So those are the kind of 2 main sources of data that I use, these kind of survey data and then the transcripts from those workshops. And then I also did a follow-up survey at the end to kind of test the resonance of what I found, because I think one thing it's important to know about the book is that rather than kind of asking about particular views of particular political parties, it's asking about ideas of parties in general, like it's a category of organisation. Now, that was the kind of trade-off that I had to make, because asking about each of 6 parties on a survey would have massively extended the length and resulted in fatigue. So what I did with the follow-up survey was then apply the generalised findings to look at attitudes towards specific parties. Just to kind of test whether that was a intervening variable. So those are kind of the main methods, and what I do is try and entwine them within chapters so that it's never fully one or the other, but that you're getting both kinds of insights alongside one another to really build up a richer picture of what was going on.
Actually, I congratulate you on that, because one of my gripes about a lot of the party studies is it's based solely on quantitative work, and the fact that you've combined the quantitative and the qualitative, I think gives your book a richness in terms of understanding. Okay, let's go on then to the main themes of your book, and the main themes are what? Representation, participation, governance, and conduct. Perhaps you'd like to say a little bit about each of those themes.
Yeah, it was really difficult knowing where to start in terms of how to kind of, what to ask people about parties. So initially, my kickoff point when I started the book was thinking about the idea of democratic linkage. So there's a really rich scholarship around what we mean by linkage. And from that work, I kind of identified the significance of representation. And also, participation is actually a separate thing from representation, and I really thought that it should be studied as a distinct category on its own right. And then I also, if those two are kind of thinking about the party's relations with citizens, I also then wanted to look at how parties govern. And so originally I was intending to look at just these 3 things, and the kind of party survey was designed around looking at those 3. But the more I read into it and the more I started kind of looking into public perceptions, this kind of 4th theme really emerged as very dominant, which was the idea of party conduct. And this has become a really prominent theme over recent years. So we've seen a lot of work looking at, the way that party competence, for example, or behaviour in office really can affect people's vote choice. And the idea that, if you're seen to have authenticity or to have a really strong leader, potentially that can also have an influence on how parties are perceived. So kind of in the process of writing, I decided to integrate this 4th aspect, to think about whether people had perceptions of party conduct that could help us understand what was going on here. And I'm really pleased I kind of did that, because I think it really added something extra to the analysis and really allowed me to kind of dig into a lot of the qualitative insights and data collection that we did. And then, so I think, so there's those 4 broad themes, and they form the main body of the book. And then I think it might just be useful to say kind of the way I tried to write the book was that I wanted it to be possible to pick it up, and if you're interested in representation, to just read it almost as a standalone chapter. So each chapter is then kind of divided under certain headings, which tease apart and examine key ideas that are raised within that body of scholarship. So in the representation chapter, for example, there's a kind of brief overview of debates around representation, and then I present public opinion data around people's perceptions of party style of representation, the source of representation and who should be being represented by parties, and then the degree of responsiveness and how much people wanted to see parties kind of react to what they were saying. So if you're kind of interested just in representation, you can kind of dip into each of those subsections and get access to the specific insights that I found on that. But if you're interested in the whole of how, all the data, then what I tried to do is then in the 6th chapter of the book, it's really kind of going through the data from across those 4 headings and trying to look at the kind of commonalities and themes that we see in these kind of different areas and work out what these tensions and contradictions and people's very varied desires actually mean.
Can I pick up on one that really struck me? And this was your distinction between responsiveness and responsibility, and that the public really do distinguish between the two, and they will judge a party in those terms and respect a party that, for example, is responsible. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we had a couple of different questions in different chapters that were looking at this. So there was some stuff in the governing chapter and some stuff in the chapter on representation. So I think having read so much about populism and about how people just wanted parties to be completely responsive, I was really expecting people to be very much, the party should just listen to public opinion, they shouldn't kind of stick to their principles, they shouldn't think about the kind of greater good. But actually the breakdown was kind of much more nuanced, and there was this recognition that although people were kind of initially attracted to the idea of being responded to all the time, actually when you kind of dug into the survey data was more complicated than that, but specifically in the focus groups, it was fascinating talking to people and kind of see them go on this kind of journey from going, yeah, parties should just do what I want to do, of course, and then just the more you kind of just left them space to think about it and to think about the implications of that, they would actually kind of start going, oh, actually, maybe being responsive all the time isn't really the be all and end all. Maybe we do need parties to be to act responsibly and to think about the national interests and the good of the population. And so I think it was certainly a more nuanced picture than some of the narrative around populism might convey.
And that, I think, is where the richness of your qualitative data comes in, because just a straight opinion poll question may well miss the fact that actually people do have, once you begin to probe, much more nuanced views of political parties. What about another area that you say is parties need to be open and inclusive? What did you mean exactly by that?
Yeah, so this was kind of one of the themes that emerged across all of the chapters. And I think it's kind of useful to think about how most people understand parties to operate today. And I think, there's still a very prevailing perception that parties are very closed organisations. They're kind of dominated by factions and the trade unions, and the kind of tropes that roll off people's tongues were really interesting to look at. And there was a real desire for parties to be not listening to a closed small set of ideas and acting in accordance with those values and principles, but actually going out and hearing from a much wider range of views and perspectives. And I think there was some fascinating data here, some great stuff in the chapter on participation. One of my own particular favourite findings was that actually people have quite complicated views about where that process should happen, of going and listening, and who should be involved in these kind of expansive processes. And there was we found that people really want parties to kind of go out and listen to experts, just your average member of the public, to people from opposing perspectives, from a whole range of different sources, and gather a load of evidence. And they really want those communities to be able to kind of get involved with very little cost, without really having to do very much, in processes around kind of political discussion and around kind of single issue campaigning. But what was interesting is that although there's this almost, initial process of opening up, of gathering all these views, there was still this idea that for some of the processes that parties kind of do later on, so, making policy or kind of coming to a decision, having heard all these views, they needed to be done by a smaller group of people. And I think what really started to emerge through the findings was that people almost wanted to know that parties had done the listening. And they wanted them to go out to gather different views, but then they didn't expect all of those people to be involved in the kind of actual decision making of parties. They felt that that should be done by a smaller group of people who could then be held accountable for the choices. So what became essential was for parties to kind of really be open, to listen to different views, and then to kind of come up with a position and to explain how they'd come to that process. And I think that was a really interesting insight for me, because as we might talk about a bit later, I think what's kind of interesting is that I think if you told some parties that, they go, well, we already do that. But I think what's interesting is that the public don't perceive parties to be operating in that way. They still think of smoke-filled rooms and, very dogmatic leaders who refuse to listen to other perspectives and kind of hear reason. And I think that's a really important, I think it's really important for parties to understand that, because it's as much about making sure that they appear to be open and inclusive, and to make sure that people understand the ways that they are actually functioning.
Open and inclusive, but again, one of the things that came out in your research is they also respect principled points of view, don't they? They look to parties to advocate principled points of view. So the idea of a political party being open to everyone, any ideas, is not the case in terms of your research.
No, definitely not. And I think, again, this was one of the cases where the qualitative insight was so valuable, because there's a question in the chapter on governance about the national interest, and there was this kind of huge majority who said they wanted parties to act in the national interest and not to be led by like kind of values and ideas. And I wasn't surprised, I suppose, when I saw that, because I think the national interest is one of those ideas that's just so vacuous. It can mean anything. And I initially read it when I saw the survey as going, right, so people don't want dogmatic partisan politicians, they want this kind of neutral technocratic governance approach. But when we went into the workshops and started asking people about this, that wasn't really what they wanted at all. They were still, when we kind of said, well, what do you mean by the national interest? Can you kind of explain what that is? Is it about being neutral and not having coming down one side or the other? People were very much like, no, you have to have values underpin a vision of the national interest. It's not possible to have a valueless conception of what is in the national interest. There's always values involved there. So what it becomes important to think about is then, so if values are there, then how is a value-driven approach to coming up with a vision of what should be happening for society, how is that perceived by people to be different to acting in accordance with party principles? And I think the thing that really came out through a number of different data points was that people just really think that parties currently are dogmatic. They think that they are closed-minded. And I think this isn't new. I think we knew this from existing survey data that's been gathered elsewhere. But people think that parties are horribly tribal and closed-minded. And I think that they don't associate that kind of behaviour with being value-led. They see it as being closed and uncompromising. And so I think one of the interesting things is some of these issues aren't easy to resolve, but that is a big difference in the minds of a lot of the people who were responding to the survey. And I think parties need to think about that and about, what could they do differently to kind of give this impression that they're not dogmatic, but that they are offering a value-led vision of society. And by doing so, they're able to offer choice.
Yeah. You just said then parties need to think about this. And I wonder, in a sense, quite clearly, there's a whole academic community that will be very, very interested in your work. But if I was to say to you, how would you actually influence political parties. What would you take to political parties from your research that you would say this is the sort of thing that you ought to be doing and thinking about?
Yeah, I think this is a really tricky question. It's something that I really wrestled with, because I think at the beginning I said, I don't offer neat prescriptions. And I think that's something that I wanted to do when I set out. I wanted to kind of say, well, this kind of approach and this kind of response is more likely to help you as opposed to this one. But it kind of comes down to the fact that actually there's something ethereal about what we're talking about. It's about it is about ethos and about the feeling that you create around the parties. So I think for parties that accept my findings about what the people want, and I think there's other responses if they don't accept that, we can talk about that. But if a party's kind of going, okay, we buy into what you're saying, and we want to kind of look at some reforms or changing to kind of make us be able to align more closely with what people desire, I think the thing I would encourage is stop doing one-off initiatives that are supposedly going to fix things. I think, one of the most recent ones was the Liberal Democrats were looking at a supporters network as well, and I was reading the kind of documentation around that and the things that they were claiming that was going to do for the party in terms of, really making it reconnect with the people and, re-foster this kind of sense of vibrancy. And I think the problem with one-off initiatives is that they might address one of the principles that I'm offering, but they are unlikely to address all of them. And I think actually what is required is a much more holistic rethinking of how political parties want to relate to people and how they are shaping expectations about what those interactions are going to look like. So with the supporters network scheme, for example, it's actually, there's been some great work by Jeff Scarland that's kind of looked at, there's almost been like a backfire effect where, on the surface, creating a supporters network makes parties more open and inclusive. But what they then didn't go on to do is kind of think about how they manage that balance between the responsive and responsibility angle that kind of comes up next in my list, which is they didn't convey to people what influence they would have or how their views were going to be heard and to inform the decision making. And so a lot of people in the Labour case got involved and just felt really frustrated because they didn't feel that they were being communicated to. They didn't understand how their ideas were informing the kind of principled visions that parties were operating. And so it created a lot of frustration and actually probably led parties to seem less inclusive. It was seen more as a stunt. They were getting all these people involved, but they weren't actually listening to them. And I think so, if you're thinking about a one-off idea like that, you need to really think about, well, how is this scheme going to work in terms of the broader party ethos? Is it, how do we want to be governed? How do we want kind of ordinary citizens to play into our decision making? How are we going to communicate to people when we are going to listen to them, but also when we aren't going to listen to them? And how are we going to decide when to respond and when not to respond? And I think these are absolutely fundamental questions that inform the day-to-day operation of parties, but which there is so little space to think about. And I think I did some interviews with kind of senior officials within political parties, and I think the traditional academic turning up to talk to some head of strategy in the Labour Party being like, so how do you represent people? And it was, unsurprisingly, they couldn't really answer because they weren't questions that they thought about. And I think that actually that is probably quite a problem because it means that things tend to be bolted on. And actually what I think is needed is a really thorough consideration of what are the guiding principles that underpin how parties want to relate to people and how are they going about shaping and enacting those principles. So I think if parties do want to do it, it's not going to be easy, but I think actually thinking about if there's a space or somewhere within the party that these conversations can start to happen is going to be really important.
Just inevitably, because of the research constraints, you're talking about British parties. Do you think that any of the work that you've done comparative scholars, European scholars in particular, do you think that they would look at this and think, yes, this is of relevance to us also in terms of our research on the future of political parties across Europe?
Yeah, I would have loved this to be comparative. I think it would be so fascinating to see if the same ideals and desires actually recurred in different places. And I think, that's kind of one of the things that is an obvious extension of the work that I did, is actually thinking about, are these ideas universal? But I think even if other countries and people in other countries don't buy up to the ideals that I've recognised, I think the process of asking questions in this kind of way and thinking about ideals and practices and thinking about the different ways that people are answering questions and the kind of patterns in responses that we can see within surveys and qualitative data, and thinking about, identifying ideas through this kind of methodology is something that other people will hopefully be able to draw inspiration from.
And in terms of your own future research on political parties, where does this take you? Where do you go next in terms of your own research and interests?
So I think at the beginning in the intro, it kind of said that I've been working with the House of Lords Committee on democracy and digital technology, and that kind of hints at my other interests. I think when I got funding for the project that this book has come from, it was looking at how digital technology could potentially be used as a solution to help political parties kind of resolve these issues that they were experiencing. And kind of within the first 2 months, it became very clear that there were two massive projects there. There was the one that's underpinned the book about what do people want from parties and actually what is the problem, because it became very clear to me when I started the research that actually we didn't really have a clear understanding of what the problem was. Whereas I think this book helps us understand that. And now what my kind of current work is doing, and what I have been doing alongside writing this book, is thinking about the possibilities that digital technology affords and how parties are kind of using those tools and techniques to reconnect with people, whether they are trying to have a more interactive approach, whether they're kind of trying to think about being more open and inclusive, and whether there's a model around this idea of the digital party, which has been written about by a number of scholars, that are kind of characterized by being more interactive, more grassroots led, whether there's a model around that where you could see parties potentially reconnect with people and offer a different ethos facilitated through digital technology. So I've become really interested in those questions, and it's led to a whole kind of broader research agenda that I'm now interested in around kind of the role of digital and data and how parties are using that in politics.
But that's not the sole solution, is it? One of the things that slightly worry me about some of the digital enthusiasts is that they say the whole answer to these particular problems is the digital party. And I think, as you yourself point out in the book, there are particular problems with that sort of digital approach in other European countries that you refer to in the book, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, I think there's a few places in the book where you can see my interest in digital creep in, and I think that some of my the kind of discussions in the workshops that I found most fascinating were hearing people talk about their experience of digital technology and their concerns about what it couldn't offer. And I think there is a survey question that asks, would you like political parties to kind of perform these functions by, online, offline, or a combination of both? And people do want both. I think, they can see that online and digital technology has a number of advantages. It kind of, it's much easier to get involved. It's a much less costly form of engagement. But there was one participant I remember who was talking about the fact that there's something about seeing someone face to face and having a conversation with someone that for them makes politics come alive, and that they just didn't get that by being sat in front of a computer or casting a vote online. And I think that's really important, is that there's something about the offline world that is so important in terms of making human connections. And so although I think we should be embracing digital technology, for me it's like only ever a portion of the solution, and we should never neglect the kind of fundamental activities of political parties and how they operate.
Okay, I've got one final question, and it comes back to your title, the reimagined party, which I like very much, and I love this example you gave of the Mini. And you're a car enthusiast, I'm not, and my question is, was that reinvention, was it successful? Have Mini sales gone up? Is it very much, a car on the road? In other words, the analogy you draw is one that you can be fairly optimistic about in terms of political parties today.
Yeah, well, I don't have many sales stats, but the amount of the new type of Mini you see on the streets today, and they've now launched a number of different models based on that updated version, which is kind of just looks a bit chunky to me. I'm a fan of the classic, but I think it does offers a good sign for parties, and I think the danger is that parties just kind of carry on with this. Every now and then a new leader comes in and goes, we need to reconnect, and they try a one-off initiative, and that we never really get this more fundamental rethinking. But I would just say, I am an optimist, and I do think there is potential for parties to change. And I think we can see that by looking at the history of these organisations. They've constantly adapted and evolved. But I'm not saying that this is going to offer a panacea or a solution, or that it's going to last. I think the reason I like the idea of imagination as well is because it's a continual process. The new Mini will also become out of date, and we'll have to kind of continue thinking about how it evolves. And I think parties need to potentially shift their mindset to think about this as to, constantly trying to work out that, adaptation is the new normal, and you need to think about how to shift and be responsive and evolve. And importantly, for me, it's about explaining that process to people and being much more communicative as organisations. But I think there's hope.
Thank you. I have to say at the end that for someone who's studied parties for longer than I care to think, I do think the work, with the research on which it's based and the conclusions you draw to, I do think that this will, stand its time as a classic in party literature.
Oh, thank you, Pat.
So I think
Thank you very much for that excellent discussion. I think this is a great time to open up the event to questions from the audience. So if you haven't already, do type your questions into the questions option of the event dashboard. So our first question from an audience member is, hi Kate, this book will be essential reading for my second year political party students at Lincoln. I agree that there are certain assumptions in the existing literature regarding decline. Your approach is really refreshing. I have an interest in political leadership. How much did you find that contemporary views of parties are channeled through views of the party leaders?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So the only data I have on this is through the qualitative data, where we kind of gave people a bit more opportunity to unpack what they were thinking about. And I think I'd never written a survey before I did this book, and I found it quite amazing how you very quickly have to make decisions that you can't ask about everything you want to ask. And asking about leaders and the party more broadly was one of the compromises that I had to make. But we did get some really interesting data within the workshops, and I certainly remember people talking about leaders being really emblematic of the culture that other kind of that the party was seen to then embody. So a lot of people were kind of talking about Farage being really authentic, and he was really seen as emblematic of the party. And when you actually ask people about their understanding of UKIP at the time, they didn't really actually have a sense of how that party operated or what it was doing, or whether it was kind of open or stuck to principles or any of those things. They were very much thinking about the party leader. So I think there's some really interesting further analysis to do, which is kind of teasing apart how much are parties thought of as discrete entities, whereas how much are they connected to a particular personality or leader at a particular point in time. So I think it's a really good question. I don't have the data to kind of give you a broken down answer, but I think it's certainly something that I'd like to look at more.
Thank you very much. And we have a second question. Hello, Kate and Pat. Many thanks for a great presentation. The book sounds fascinating and I look forward to reading it. My question is, what is your advice for the Labour Party, i.e., what does the party have to do to win again?
See, this is where I could earn an awful lot as a consultant if I had the neat answer to this question. What I would say is that I think the Labour Party has done an awful lot over recent years in terms of thinking about how it tries to expand its membership and get involved. And I think it's actually in quite a kind of complicated and messy position where it's got, you know, different kind of classifications of members and supporters, and even people who've kind of signed up for information but aren't formally affiliated to the party in any way. And I really think that for Labour, the kind of key question is, you know, how are you going to interact with these people and work out how to make that operate, and think about what kind of influence are these people being given and how can that be conveyed? Because I think there's a danger that, you know, if Labour kind of just opens up again and goes for another drive of supporters, that it's going to start being seen as a bit of a hollow activity. So I think that if I were advising Keir Starmer, I'd kind of say, you know, have a think about what you think members and ordinary people offer to your party, and what do you offer them? Because Labour has always positioned itself as a political movement that's championing the ideas of a whole, you know, section of society. But in order to do that, people need to know that their ideas are going somewhere and that they're being fed in and that they have influence. So I think if they want to carry on building upon that idea that has been prominent under the past few leaders, then it's really thinking about, well, what does that actually mean, and how is your ordinary member on the street or your supporter actually going to be involved and feel that their ideas are being taken up and channeled into politics?
Brilliant, thank you very much. And another question. Hello, Katharine. Do you think our voting system influences how people choose their political party or place their vote? Surely the first past the post system does shape how citizens respond to parties. How would citizens respond differently if we had PR?
Yeah, 100%. This was something that I was really interested in looking at, and we had at the end of the workshops, we did this kind of thing to reinvigorate the workshop participants after 4 hours. Where we kind of got them, we had created kind of 2 markers within a room, and we got them to physically move between the polls to indicate what their view was on a specific question. And one of the questions we asked is, to what extent are the problems with political parties to do with how parties themselves operate as opposed to the political system as a whole? And in that instance, nearly everyone went up to the political system as a whole being the problem. They didn't feel that it was necessarily political parties themselves. And I think that's really interesting, because it suggests when we then kind of ask people why they position themselves there were actually a whole range of different things that came up. The voting system was definitely one. And I think there were a lot of calls for PR and a need to rethink and redistribute, you know, to make having your vote worthwhile. So I think that I can imagine under a proportional system, you would be able to loosen the system of party whips, which a lot of people associate with this kind of idea of parties being dogmatic and being not able to be listening and responsive. And I think you would allow parties to become much more responsive to local views and ideas, and to become more communicative about explaining what it was that they were doing and why. And I think the current party system really doesn't help that dynamic. So perhaps parties should also be pushing for PR as a way to kind of make their job in appealing to the public much easier.
Thank you very much. And another question, do you think the questionnaire or the focus group data better represents the gut feelings of voters that influence their day-to-day levels of engagement and participation? Or perhaps did you force people to apply critical thinking within the focus groups that they do not normally use when engaging with politics?
Yep, this is why I did both methods. So there's a bit in the introduction where I talk about how I kind of understand public opinion, and you know, it's widely acknowledged that public opinion is it's a kind of, you know, as asked through surveys, it does tend to be very reactive, and it tends to be the kind of top of the head, very associative thinking that kind of people come up with. So it's not really surprising that a lot of that is kind of picking up on prominent media discourses and narratives. And that's why I wanted to do the workshops, is to see, well, how resilient are those? Because I think you can acknowledge that people's kind of, as one scholar calls them, kind of conventional discourses, they're kind of the ideas that they go to are going to be fairly shallow and probably negative. And we tested this in the workshops, where we started by asking everyone to write down 3 words that they associated with political parties. And of the 75 respondents, we got kind of over 200 words, and not a single one was positive or neutral. They were all negative. And one of these workshops was composed entirely of party activists, and they were all negative. So I think it kind of showed how dominant these negative ideas are. Now, how that kind of translates into voting, I think, depends on your view of how extensively people think about casting their vote. Now, there's certainly one line of thinking that says most people just kind of only engage on that surface level. But I think what I found interesting is that it didn't actually take much to push people beyond that negativity. So it was only by kind of asking the question in a slightly different way that people started to kind of be much more thoughtful and considerate about how they were thinking about parties, and to actually recognise their value within society. So in some ways, that as my optimism tries to win through this sea of negativity, I think that is, to some degree, you could draw some reassurance from that, because it suggests that if people do, you know, engage a little bit more, maybe think about a specific policy issue when they're going into the voting booth, rather than just like parties as general, that they're going to be engaging in a different kind of thinking. But that's kind of supposition on my part, based on kind of the observations as a whole. I think working out what goes on in the mind of voter in a voter booth is a very difficult question.
Thank you very much. And now another question. Do your findings apply equally to all parties, or did your respondents draw clear distinctions between the behaviour of different parties? If so, to what extent was this a function of whether or not they identify with the policies of one party rather than another?
Yeah, great question. So this was one of my big concerns about asking about parties in general. So there were 2 things that I did to test this. So throughout the book, I used logistic regressions, which are all in the back of the book. I, as someone who isn't a kind of natural statistician, I felt it was really important to make the book as accessible to people who didn't have advanced statistical training. But what we did is, for all of the kind of models in the book, you can kind of go back and have a look, and we regressed to have a look at whether the patterns that we were finding within the data were being predicted by kind of different partisan feelings. And that just didn't emerge as different partisan loyalties didn't emerge as a predictor of the different outcomes that we were coming up with. But I was still very cautious about this, because everything that I know about party politics is how important partisan identity is. And in an ideal world, I would have asked about perceptions of every single party. So what I did was, in the follow-up party survey that I mentioned, I essentially went back and took the principles that I'd identified as associated with the reimagined party, and then asked party supporters of the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and UKIP first kind of how they judged each of those 3 parties to measure against the standards, and then looked at kind of the variation. And what I found was that there is a very clear influence of party ID here in judging your own party favourably, which is unsurprising. It correlates with kind of everything that we know about party politics. So this indicates that basically this kind of comes back to that point I'm saying, it's not easy to satisfy here, and there isn't a quick fix to draw from these conclusions, because a Labour Party supporter could see the Conservative Party reform in line with every single one of these principles and still judge them really harshly, because partisanship is such an important predictor. But it appears that there is a room to kind of alter people's perceptions at the margins. And I think, you know, coming up with a way of overcoming partisan prejudices is something that I never thought I would be able to do. But you can certainly see that it does inform how people do judge parties. But kind of what was interesting is that you see that party family effect come out. So, you know, UKIP supporters were judging the Conservative Party more favourably than the Labour Party. So it suggests that within the kind of ideological spectrum that you identify with, that parties might be able to take action that allows them to be kind of seen in more positive terms.
Thank you very much. We have another question. I like the car analogy, but if I can't buy the car I want, I'll buy another make. Do people need political parties in the same way that they need motor cars?
Oh, that's great. Well, I think that, you know, there are other car models out, and you can shop around for your political party. But I think the thing that just really struck me is that people didn't want to reject parties. They were fundamentally attracted to them. And I think you can even see this in some of the existing survey data that's out there that I kind of look at in chapter 1, is there kind of are these questions that have been asked historically about, you know, whether kind of parties are a necessary evil. We've framed them very neutrally. And there are kind of signs that people do support the idea of party democracy. And I think that if you kind of think about other representative institutions and other ways of governing, parties do, in their ideal form, do something quite unique. You know, they perform this kind of balancing linkage act where they are governing and they're linking citizens. And the kind of other types of organisation, for example, like civil society bodies or NGOs, don't perform that dual function. So I think that parties do something unique. So I don't think that it's easy to kind of find an alternative to kind of step in and take on that role, because you'll always be making a compromise in terms of losing that capacity to balance the link both ways.
Thank you very much. And another audience member has asked if they can have a look at your data.
Oh, yeah. So it's ESRC funded, so it's all available on the UKRI data archive.
Okay, brilliant. And we have another question. Hello, Kate. Your book sounds fascinating and so innovative. To what extent is the resistance to change a byproduct of parties fearing party members? They're seen as being too keen, weird, or purists, and to some extent the public. And to what extent do members of the public want to be involved in party policy making?
Yeah, well, I think that characterization of party members is certainly something that resonates with the wider public. I think whether party leaders are not pursuing reform for that reason, I can't really say. But I think that there is certainly a kind of case for thinking more extensively about engaging people in different ways. Now, when it kind of comes to that question of, do people actually want to get involved? So this is something that I've been thinking about kind of writing up something specific about this, because I do think that there is always this kind of innate push that just assumes people want to get involved. And I asked about this in kind of 2 questions that for me I really wanted to tease it apart. And I was saying, you know, I gave people a whole range of options of how they could get involved in parties, and I asked if they'd done it in the past, if they kind of might plan to do it in the future, or if they'd like, if they think there should be opportunities to do it. And what we found is that although people said that there should be more opportunities to do everything, and it should be much more easier to do everything, when you actually ask them if they intended to do it in the future, like over 2/3 of people said they had no intention to do the thing that they thought should be definitely available. And I think that might just leave, you know, you can very cynically say, well, people just say they want everything, and you're never going to satisfy them. But I think to me it shows that it kind of taps into this idea that kind of connects with the stealth democracy and the ocular democracy literature, which is that just because people aren't necessarily using a participatory opportunity doesn't mean that they don't think it should be there, so that if they become activated by something, they know that they could get involved. And I think that that's the kind of important thing to think about, is that you might, if a party kind of creates a new initiative, they might not, well, indeed my data would suggest they're unlikely to see this huge surge of enthusiasm for people to get involved. But the fact that people know that they could get involved, and even better, if they know what would happen as a result of if they did get involved, would be attractive. So I don't think we should equate people's perception of how party is working and how it's viewed with what they then choose themselves to do. I think they are 2 very different things, and often we've used participation as a proxy for perceptions, and I really think we need to kind of uncouple those 2 things.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think this is a good moment to wrap up this armchair event and to thank everyone for attending, but also to thank you, Katharine and Patrick, for giving up your time to participate.